All right, we left off on part one right about here. And in part one, we learned about how to create a topography from a CAD file. So you can create the CAD file first if you want to, and then just pull that into Revit. We learned that. We also talked about how to link projects together. And this is something that's really important. We do this all the time, cross disciplines. We can pull in a background from one company, like the surveyor, the topo from the surveyor, and then we can either draw on top of that, or we can even link additional files into that same sort of common file in the middle. Linking projects together helps keep us from modifying or editing the stuff that doesn't belong to us, and that's really important as well. If we go in and we start changing the stuff that other consultants or other companies are providing to us, we can really get ourselves in trouble because things aren't where they're supposed to be. And there are all kinds of ways that we can adjust and change the view settings of those linked models without actually changing what those models look like or what their structure is. We left off by doing some fancy stuff to the actual topography, and remember that we can adjust the individual elevation points within the topography to change its overall shape. So today what we're going to be talking about are some other ways that we can pull in topography for a project, and some of you might opt to do this just to save time or maybe even make it a little more realistic. We're going to be talking about some third-party software that we can use to extract topography from the real world and bring it into our Revit models. We're also going to be exploring some different ways that we can change the surface once it's created and once we have it where we want it. Both in terms of the color and also the materials that we're applying to that surface. So we can do things within or on top of, sort of like painting on top of the topography. Instead of creating separate elements like a sidewalk or a driveway, we can actually just color the topography to look like concrete in just certain areas. And then we'll finish up by talking about placing site components. So finishing that exterior, we're going to talk about some strategies for landscaping, doing a little bit of landscaping design. And by no means are we going to try to make anybody experts, but definitely want you to use some of your creativity on this. There aren't a ton of places where we get to be super creative. This is one of them though. So if you have an interest in exterior design or landscaping architecture, this is your chance to kind of test your skills out a little bit. All right, so one of the things we should point out right up front is that oftentimes on projects where we're collaborating with other disciplines, we're going to do sort of a mirror link, right? So we've linked the house, which presumably somebody else designed, into this project where we created the topo. Oftentimes what we'll do is we'll share that topo with the people that created the house, and then they'll link it the other way, right? They'll link that topo into their project. And the reason that's important is so that neither one sort of loses track of what the other one is doing, so that they always jive with each other. In the situation where you're working on both, it is okay to have the topo in the same project as the house. It's just that keeping them separate sometimes makes more sense because it prevents you from changing that topography if you're working on the house and vice versa accidentally. Now we can also pin things. There's also constraints we can put on things to sort of overcome that. But working with links and or inserts is an important skill to have because it's done pretty frequently in industry. So just to be clear about what I'm talking about, I would or could, if I wanted to, open up this house project, which is not open right now, it's just linked into the model, right? But if I opened the house project, I would not see the topography. And hopefully that makes sense why, right? We've only linked the house into the topography model. We haven't linked the topography into the house model, but we certainly could. All right. Hopefully that's clear as mud. Moving on. Let's talk about how we can change some of how this topography looks. So one of the things we did when we created this topo was we used different phases. And I just want to take a little bit deeper dive into the phasing discussion because it applies not just to projects like this, but also projects that are, for example, if we're working on a renovation, we have an existing phase, which is already built. It's an as-built model, right? And then we might have to be doing something like putting on an addition or reconfiguring an interior. Maybe in a high-rise office building, for example, we're going to gut the entire interior portion of it and we're going to rebuild it with different, shapes and hallways and paths and things like that. And in those situations, it's important that we keep track of the phases because we can make them look different and we can also control their visibility separate from one another. So understanding how, when we look at, for example, this site plan, why does the topography look like this? Well, we've changed it, but we've also tracked the changes in terms of the phases that it was done. So the phases that we have available in this project are new, existing, and demo, right? All these different phases that kind of come into play. And you can see right now the phase is set to new construction. But if we change that to existing, obviously it's going to change. Like the entire building went away for one thing, and then all the changes that we made to the topography kind of went back to original, right? So this gives us the ability to show both the pre-construction and the post-construction intent all within one project without having to make copies and different copies of the same thing in different forms. So the phasing is controlled. This is controlling what phase we're looking at right now. And right now it's set to existing, but if we change that back to new construction, we can also apply these phase filters. And the phase filters are there basically to give us the ability to show more than one phase at a time. For example, oftentimes when we're going to be demoing, like if we're going to be tearing out the walls, we're going to want to see those walls, but we're going to want to see them differently than what they would look like when it's finished. So in this situation, we would say show demo plus new. So we could show the old walls in their demo form, which is normally hidden lines, and then we would show the new walls, which would be the prominent feature on the page in their new location where they're going to be after construction. Most contractors can look at a plan that shows both the demo and the new, and they can easily interpret what needs to come out and what's going to go back in its place. Okay, so let's kind of just take a look at some of these other phase filters. We're going to say show all, and that's going to basically show you the revised or the old basically as a demo, right? And the existing sort of as the solid lines. We'll go down here and say show demo plus new. And it doesn't, I don't think this one really changed much. No, it doesn't, because that's actually showing both anyway. You just can't see the new underneath the demo. So for topography, these phase filters maybe aren't as relevant or useful, but we can certainly get down to show complete, and that in this case we have the ability to show it when it's all done. This is the intended finished grading that we want to have for this project. Oftentimes we would show those as two separate views, right? We would show one view or one sheet sort of as the existing and then one as the intended result. So that's sort of a quick crash course into phasing. Phasing, I believe we have another lesson on phasing that goes a little bit deeper and applies it to the actual building itself. Let's go ahead and talk about some other things. If we're creating a site plan, we're going to have a few features on here that we don't deal with a lot in Revit. Some things you certainly would have talked about and demonstrated in your Civil 3D class. But Revit has some rudimentary skills, certainly nothing that goes as deep as Civil 3D, but for a site plan, you can definitely put enough stuff into your model to get a pretty decent site plan out of it. So some of those features include the contour lines themselves. Those contour lines can be controlled and manipulated to look certain ways. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then labeling those contour lines also to show the exact elevation of them is another thing that we can add. So we're going to demonstrate that as well. And then we're going to talk briefly about property lines. We're going to add some property lines and label those as well. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is select the topo solid. And this year, 2024, Revit's decided to move that settings for the topo lines into the type properties, which I guess makes sense. It's just a little head fake for everybody that's been doing this for a while and did it a different way. But all you have to do is select that and then go into the type properties, and in there you're going to find the contour display setting. So that's going to open up this window, and this window is now showing two different settings for the topo lines. One for the primary contours, those are the thick ones. Those are supposed to be every 5th line, and then the secondary contours would be those thinner ones between, those 4 that are in between each of the primaries. And so you can see that the spacing or the interval is set as such. So every 5th foot vertical, we're representing one of those primary contour lines, and then every foot vertical, it will be the secondary ones. So that's set about where I would like it. I think we can all use our best judgment by looking at these things, and you can see that the density is pretty descriptive. It shows pretty good detail on the contours at this scale, also at this steepness that we're dealing with the topo surface. And results are going to vary. So just depending on the job that you're working on and how it comes in, you might have to adjust that. In our case, we really don't. What we will adjust though are, what these things look like sometimes. So sometimes when we get in here, we're going to see a range. This is the visibility range basically. It will not generate topo lines outside of this range. So we're going basically from 100 feet below zero to 1,000 feet above zero. So you just need to make sure that that range, it's sort of like view range, but it's only pertains to the topo surface itself. It doesn't affect everything in the view. So yours is probably going to start at 0. I would just change both of these to negative 100 feet. And you can make it higher than 1,000, or you can make it lower than negative 100, as long as it encompasses all of the topo lines that you want to display. So once you've modified yours to look like this, we should be good to go. If you don't have 2 different things in there at this time, go ahead and just insert another one. If you have more than 2, just delete the ones you don't need. But yours should look just like this when you're all done. Just say OK, OK again, and we have it the way we want it. Now I have already added the contour line labels to this one. I'm just going to go ahead and take those out just to demonstrate how we're going to do that. And you might think because it's sort of an annotation that you'd find it on the Annotate tab, but this one actually, they have their own button, Label Contours, right on the Massing and Site tab. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And basically all you have to do there is just cross all of the primary contour lines. So what we're going to do is just going to draw a single line all the way through, just to kind of demonstrate this for starters. You can see here that the 130 is labeled, the 125 is labeled, and the 120 is labeled. So every 5 feet, in other words, every primary contour line, that's what's getting labeled. That is actually driven by the type properties of the labels themselves, which you can see here listed as 3/32. Now yours, probably by default, you started with this one right here, which looks like this, every single contour line labeled. To me, that seems just a little excessive. We normally are only going to label the primary contour lines, but again, it just kind of depends on the project you're working on. Certainly on this one, I would say that this is excessive. We don't need to have this many labels in here to really understand what's going on. So what you can do is select Edit Type. You can go in and duplicate that and then just change the settings. You can see that there's a setting right here called Label Primary Contours Only. That was the only thing I changed really. And then this one right here, Text Size. I just changed it from 1/16 to something that we use more commonly, which is 3/32. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just switch that back to the other type that I created. And that looks pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy with that. If it turned out that you really kind of had to snake around and not put these in a continuous line like this, there are other ways you can do this. You can do multiple label lines. In other words, I could just do one right here, and that's going to pick up those 2. Then I could shift over to here on my next one if I wanted to, and just kind of run it all the way through. It doesn't really matter how far the line goes because you're not going to see it anyway. It just needs to cross those primary lines or whichever lines you're trying to label. If you want more than one, if your topo is really large, you may want to put one at each end just to kind of make it easier to read. And you can have as many as you want really, just as long as you don't clutter up your drawing too much. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully that made sense. Nothing too mysterious or complicated about that. You should be able to get those contour lines looking the way that you want them to and labeled the way that you want them Let's go ahead and talk about property lines next. Property lines are also part of the main ribbon on the Massing and Site tab. And the way property lines work is you just basically have to enclose a boundary. Now, a property boundary is something that's pretty darn specific. I think we all understand that by now. The exact location of the corners of a property are so well documented in a legal document that when you have to draw one, you really need to know exactly the direction and the length of all of the legs of that property boundary. Now that might be data that you've collected during surveying, or it might be data that you received from somebody. But if you ever have to reproduce it in Revit, you should be doing that according to the exact measurements and angles, so distance and angles of that property boundary. Now I don't have that data, so for this demonstration, I'm going to be picking random points, and you can too, okay? So what I'm going to do is go to this property line tool, and remember the property boundary has to be created in a full closed loop, okay? Otherwise it's just not going to work. Now we have two options. We can either create this by entering distances and bearings, which we would normally do if we had that data, or we can create it by sketching, which means we're just making it up, pulling it out of thin air, which is what I'm going to do. All right, and I am just going to use the line tool for this, and I'm going to have chain selected here because I want it to continue. I don't want to have to keep clicking the tool. Now I'm going to say my property line is going to start right here, right inside the topo boundary. I'm going to say it's going to come up to about right here, and I'll zoom in on this next point. I'm going to say it hits right this point right here, comes back down. Maybe we'll kind of run it really close to the corner, and then the fourth side is just going to come right across here. So now it's complete. It's not uncommon to see property boundaries that fall inside the topo surface you've created, because we oftentimes survey with a little bit of a margin around the property just so that we have a little bit of fudge room in case something is there that we need to indicate or whatever. All right, so once those 4 lines are created, we can click Finish. And now we've created those property lines, and you can actually see the property lines. They're showing up just like you would expect property lines to, with that double dash or phantom line style. And if you deselect, you can see it just goes to black. Those will print as they should. Okay. Now the last thing we're gonna, and that's it. Now you've got a property boundary on that thing. Okay. The last bit would be to label the contours. Then we need to be able to identify the distance and the direction of all 4 of those. And it should match whatever data that you started with, right? Just because you recreated it in Revit doesn't mean you have the creative leeway to change anything, right? It's really important we get that right. So the way that happens is we just add tags. And the tags, remember, are on the Annotate tab. And we're just going to tag by category. Now, before we do anything fancy with this, I'm just going to let it tag this thing how it would, okay? So by default. So I'm just going to click on this property line, and it says, there is no tag loaded for property line. Do you want to load one now? So when you start dealing with tags, it's important to remember that when you load a family, it's all going to be in that same library, but tags are just a little bit different. They're going to be in a weird subfolder that you probably haven't spent a lot of time in. So let's go ahead and say yes for now. That's going to pull up this, and I'm already there, so I'm just going to kind of back out of this thing. But if you go to your main library where you've been going for all these other things, this is actually going to be found under Annotations. Tags are annotations, and we know that because they're on the Annotate tab in Revit. So that should be fairly easy to remember, hopefully. But if you go to Annotations, you'll see that you have architectural, civil, electrical, all the different disciplines, and then there are some basic ones that maybe just apply to any kind of project. This is specific to a civil project. Okay, so anything dealing with a site plan, usually you're going to find that under the civil category. And then once you get there, you can kind of go down and you can see this one right here, property line tag. That's the basic one. There are a few others that say property right in them, but don't get confused. It's this one right here, just the plain Jane property line tag, and you can see it gives you a preview of what that's going to look like. And that's exactly what it should look like. You're going to have the direction on one line, the distance on the other line, and those typically are going to straddle the property line. So let's go ahead and try it. Okay, so if I hover over the property line, you can see that now it's giving me the preview. It looks really good. I'm going to click, and that's what it looks like. This line happens to be north 36 degrees exactly, east, and it's exactly 228 feet long. I'm not sure how I accomplished that. I just got lucky, I guess. Nice round numbers there. Certainly not intentional. Let's see what this next one looks like. Click. So it is, maybe it's rounding to zeros. I'm not sure. Maybe some kind of snap was on. Pick that point right there. Pick that point right there. Now all my labels are done. Yeah, so that one's definitely not round, but all the other ones kind of are. Interesting. Anyway, that's how property lines and property line tags work. Nothing too complicated there either. So we're getting close to the end of this thing. Okay, this next thing we're going to talk about is subdividing a topo solid. And I'll just give this a little bit of background. Sometimes right on the surface of a topo solid, we're going to want to apply a different material than the overall topo solid is assigned. So let's start by maybe assigning a material to this topo solid, and just for fun, we're just going to make it grass. So I'm going to click on this topo solid. You'll notice there are no instance properties that define the material that can be assigned to it. But we know through our vast experience working with components and families in Revit that there's going to be some place that we can apply a material to it. So if it's not in the instance properties, you're probably good at guessing that it's going to be in the type properties. So let's go ahead and dig into that. And we look through these parameters and look that as long as you like, you're probably not going to find a material parameter in there either. So that leads us to believe that it's probably in this structure. Just like any other system family, it's going to be built into the structure. And so here you can see that a topo solid has the ability to have multiple layers within it. So if you wanted to define different layers of strata within the topo solid, you certainly could do that, but this one happens to just be the minimum thickness is going to be 1 foot, and the material is set to by category. So let's go ahead and change that. What I'd like for it to be is grass. So I'm going to go ahead and just type grass right here, and you can see that it did find actually down below. Okay, so there's nothing loaded in the project right now, but you can see that down in my AEC materials, it did come up with a couple of things. So let's go ahead and bring this grass one up by clicking the up arrow, and that will assign it. We'll say OK. That populates. We say OK again, and OK one more time. Let's go ahead and just, for fun, switch to a 3D view so we can kind of see what's going on here. Looks like I've got a couple things going on here, so I think I need to hide one of these. Let's see if I can get it figured out, if it's the other one. Okay, I've got that. I was doing some other things in here, so I have a second topo surface in there. But regardless, let's go ahead and just change the visual style here to realistic so we can actually see the color. And now you can see that grass is applied to the whole thing. Okay, so back to the discussion. There are times when you want there to be a portion of this topo solid to be a different material. And one example of that would be sort of like a driveway. So if I brought this topo solid up to the level of the slab right in front of the garage, I could essentially paint a driveway right onto the topo solid to create the illusion of a driveway. Now that's a little bit of cheating, and it's not super convincing compared to a lot of other ways that you can do it, like actually modeling a slab. We could do that too. But in some cases it actually is a lot easier. So for example, if you had a gravel driveway that's coming across a large portion of land, and it mostly just follows the natural contour of the ground, painting on a gravel driveway is a whole lot easier than modeling a gravel driveway with a whole separate component. So another good example of that is a sidewalk. A perhaps even better example of that would be sort of a rock bed. You know how a lot of people will build a rock boundary around their house. They don't want to mow right up to their foundation, so they're just going to go ahead and do sort of a squiggly border around their house and then just fill that part up to the foundation with rock or some other material like mulch, perhaps. But in a lot of cases, that is going to follow the natural contour. So it doesn't really always make sense to create a whole separate thing. So how do we do that? Well, we have to subdivide the surface. And it doesn't exactly do what it says. It sounds like it's going to do. The subdividing a surface actually just sort of very similar to when we use the split face on a wall, right? We just sort of create a boundary on that surface, and then we can just paint inside that boundary. Okay, so let's go ahead and play around with that. I'm going to go back to the site plan for this, and I'm just going to create a driveway, and it's not going to be convincing because I messed around with the contours and they don't meet the foundation at the slab anymore, but regardless, that's okay. This is going to work just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and select the Topo Solid, and then I'm just going to click on the subdivide command. So that puts me in the sketch mode. You can see I have all my normal drawing tools up there, and all I have to do now is I have to create a closed loop, either completely contained within the boundary of that topo surface or touching the edge of it. Now I'm just going to test that theory and make sure that it's true. So I'm just going to draw some lines. I'm going to pick a point. Heck, I'm just going to pick this point right here. I'm going to come in and I'm going to hit perpendicular to this line. I'm going to come across to here and hit right here. And I'm going to come back parallel back to the edge right here. Now theoretically this is going to work just fine. Let's see if it does. Click finish. And it does not like that. So apparently it does have to be a closed loop. So I'm going to just try adding one more line, even though it's right on the edge. I'm going to just add one more line there, and let's see if that worked. Okay, so that was successful. Let's go back to the 3D view now. And you can see here that it actually added some height. It added some thickness to that thing. So this is actually maybe the way you'd want to do it. It is following the exact shape of the topo surface, of the topo solid rather, but it's thicker, and we can actually adjust how thick it is. So if we only want that to come up maybe 2 inches, something like that, that might represent that slab a little bit better, and we can just sort of adjust that. If you don't want it to come up at all, for whatever reason, if you want it to be exactly the same level as the grass, unfortunately, that's not possible, but you can get down to like a 32nd of an inch, and then it's really imperceptible. That height difference would almost not be noticed at all. All right, so you can just kind of change that right here in the subdivide height setting if I wanted that to be like 1/8 of an inch. That pretty much takes it down flat, so you can really accomplish whatever you need to with that. So these can be used for driveways. Oh, I didn't apply the material. So when you select that interior portion, and it's a little bit hard to select, you kind of got to grab the boundary. When that is selected, this is actually an instance property. So if we wanted to go ahead and set a different material like concrete to that, precast, probably not. Cast in place, how about that one? Okay. We can do that. That might not be the best choice. It's got a really random pattern that shows up there, but you get the idea. You can apply any material you want to that. So that's something that, you know, you can use that with all kinds of different features on your site plan. And mostly that's going to come into play when you're doing a rendering or some kind of an artistic thing showing like what's actually going on there. But you can also see that in a site plan view. So you can actually define where the concrete is, where the sidewalks are, the other walks, the patios, things like that. So the last thing I want to demonstrate is the fun stuff, right? This is the landscaping piece. Once you get the business end of things done, you know, you got the building in there, you got the plant, the various site work done. You have your walks and your concretes and your patio. All of that stuff's in there the way you like it. Now we can start thinking about how do we want to sort of dress this area up. And some people like to do like an island in the middle of their lawn or something, and maybe you would mulch or rock that, and maybe in the middle of it you'd have a tree or something like that. You know, you can certainly do those bordered areas using the same technique that we just demonstrated, you know, with that Topo Solid subdivision. But the actual plantings, you're going to bring in components for that, right? And so you can bring in a site component. You can do it this way, or you can use the component tool in the architecture tab as well. It's kind of basically the same thing. It's just this is going to maybe focus on the plantings only. It's going to filter it out to just the plantings. There are a number of trees that are available already in some of the templates, right? In other cases, you might have to load the family, but this works just like any other component, right? Load family, you're going to be brought to the standard library. Then you're just going to scroll down to plantings. That's where you're going to find the trees and different things that are available in the default library. Now, I will point out that some site components are not going to be in plantings for obvious reasons, right? There is a separate site folder, and there are a number of things in here that relate more to infrastructure than actual landscaping. But sometimes we need that stuff, right? You're probably not going to have a gas pump or even a bollard, but you might have a flagpole. You might have some of these other things in there. And then obviously, I think it goes without saying, there's a whole internet full of other stuff that you can download, these different Revit families that are, of varying degrees of quality, appearance-wise and so forth. But you can usually find everything that you need to. And sometimes it's just a lot of fun going out and really digging up the things that, specific things that you want to see in your 3D rendering. A note about, so I'm just going to, bring, I don't know, a dumpster in. I'm going to bring a flagpole in. When you bring it in, you can see that it's automatically, most of these things are automatically going to conform to the elevation of the topo, right? Of that topo solid. So if I wanted to place a flagpole right here, I don't have to worry about its elevation. Most of these things are going to be sort of hosted by that surface. So I'm going to go ahead and flip to a 3D view. You can see that it planted it right in the ground, exactly how you'd want it to. The same thing is true of trees. So if we wanted to bring in some trees with a site component here, flip this to a gray birch. You can either do this in 3D or you can do it in a site plan view. I tend to like to work in a plan view when I'm doing stuff like this, just because it's a little bit easier to visualize where it's going, right? In 3D, it's a little bit harder to see exactly where it's going to go. But whatever you're comfortable with, and obviously you can always move that once we get that in. We can take that tree and we can just drag it over here, put it closer to the house, whatever we want to do. A word about Enscape components. And Enscape has a fabulous library of components. Their asset library is really, since they first came out, their asset library has grown tremendously, and it's all categorized. It's got some great stuff in there. I don't want to take anything away from Enscape. The only thing I would caution you about is that their families do not look right if you don't have Enscape installed. So you can spend hours bringing Enscape props into your model, but you may never see them again if you lose access to Enscape, which you will do unless you go to work for a company that has Enscape, right? There's only so long you can go with a trial version, with an educational version, and then you kind of have to buy it. And that's the hook. They give you all this content, and then they make you buy the product so that you can continue to enjoy it in your models that you create. So just be cautious about how much Enscape stuff you bring in, and then just make sure that you get your renderings before your Enscape expires. Otherwise, you just won't be able to. Okay, so use your imagination. Go crazy with all of that stuff. There's a lot you can do to customize your particular model and make the outside really look like something real, something special. So have fun with it. If you have questions, if you run into snags, obviously reach out. And I think that's it. We'll see you all next time in class.